Good.
Got it.
It's called.
Perfect. So I think we can get started introducing ourselves. I don't know if everyone have met me yet, or maybe Shai. So just welcome everyone. It's so great to see all of you here, and I'm really, really excited for the class today. I've been having a lot of fun with Shai, I think, preparing for all these classes for sure, and we're very excited about it. Shai, maybe everyone don't know you yet, so why don't you introduce yourself and take it away?
Absolutely. Good evening, everybody. Great to see all the faces on the screen. My name is Shai Ashkenazi. I'm the Shaliach, the Israeli emissary at the Poses JCC and in the community here in Northern Virginia. So I work from the Poses JCC, but I work with the different congregations and organizations. Always a pleasure working with that Chaim as a great, great partner in all fronts. And I'm just going to give the background a little bit. Jonathan contacted me and said, sometimes it's not easy talking about Israel, so we want to talk about Israel, but we want to do it from different perspectives. So we created this series of to his idea of 3 meetings. This is our second one. The first one we talked about the connection to Israel and how we find this connection through different 5 lenses of the landscape of Israel. We talked about the imagined land, how Israel, the promised land, was imagined by the Israelites before they got into the country, and how it was imagined for generations, or maybe remembered, which is another lens, for generation of exile and diaspora. We talked about a covenantal land, that the covenant between the Jewish people and God also is on the land of Israel itself. We talked about the lived land, which is the current state of Israel mostly, and the boundaries and the politics, a little bit of that, which is usually the source of discomfort, I would say, or controversy, or what we see today and hear on the news mostly, and the envisioned land. What do we envision in the future? How would we want to see the state of Israel or the land of Israel to be in the future? And today we are going to talk about, if you can see my background, sort of diversity or populations in Israel, the different people throughout history, and what made Israel what it is today, which is a combination of so many different cultures. So this is going to be a presentation in which I am going to talk a lot. I'll try to make it interesting, I promise. Rav Natan is definitely going to add in. If you have anything to add at any point, or ask, or anything of that sort, I would encourage you to please unmute yourselves and just go ahead and talk. Be respectful of others. Thing is, while I share my screen, it's harder to see any hand raises or the chat. So because we're a small group, we can definitely have an open conversation. It is super encouraged to take part in conversation with questions or comments or any information that you can add to any part that we're going to go through. So I hope we'll have a nice ride. I have my little Turkish coffee right here, so if you want to grab something to drink, please do so. And I guess we're just gonna kick it off. Okay, so we're going to start with a very important quote from the Declaration of Independence in Israel, 1948. We talked a little bit about it. I'm going to take us back and forth a little bit with 2 weeks ago, and connect the things together. The state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the integration of the exiles meaning Jewish diaspora around the world. It will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. And we have that in Hebrew as well. So today we're going to talk about this Jewish immigration, or what we call in Hebrew in Israel, Aliyah. Aliyah, sort of like a pilgrimage to Israel. As an opposite to that, anyone who immigrates outside of Israel, we call it Yerida, going down from Israel. So we're going to talk about those aliyot, and we are going to talk about the meaning of the benefit of all its inhabitants when we talk about all of Israel's inhabitants. As we go through this, somewhat of a historical review with different details about the populations and diversity in multicultural Israel in so many ways. Let's start with a few facts and numbers. According to the Central Bureau of Statistics in Israel, these numbers are accurate according to 2019, 2020. And we can see the distribution of numbers as they are counted by the state of Israel. And we can see, from the Ottoman Empire that ruled the area from the 16th century until the 20th century, the early 20th century, and all through up until 2019-ish, the distribution of numbers, where the way that people are being counted in Israel, and we're talking about, if we talk about the map, which we will see in a bit, we're talking about within the border of Israel, within the borders of Israel, how many Muslims there are, how many Jewish people there are, how many Christians, and others. What are the others? We're going to see in a bit. We're talking about a total of about 9 million people. Out of those, about 20%, close to 20% are Muslims. We have a bit less than 500,000 of Christians and others, and we also have over 6,600,000 Jewish people. This distribution, of course, is problematic because we're talking about who are others. How do we count others? How do we count people? Who do we count as citizens? Who do we count as people who are residents of the land, but not necessarily citizens? We're going to talk about all those things today. I'm going to start with this video that has become a very important statement that was made in 2015 by former President Reuven Rivlin, in a conference in Herzliya in Israel, and he talked about the 4 tribes of Israel. I brought a short piece, about 2 minutes, from his speech, the main piece of the speech that talks about the distribution of population in Israel in the future. Let's take a look at that. We have the subtitles that you can read, because it is in Hebrew, and we're going to go on from there. I forgot to share the sound, I apologize. Okay. Here we go.
כיתות א' היום מורכבות מכ-38% חילונים ממלכתיים, כ-15% דתיים לאומיים, ממלכתיים דתיים, כרבע ערבים וקרוב לרבע חרדים. התהליכים הדמוגרפיים המעצבים מחדש את פניה של החברה הישראלית יצרו למעשה סדר ישראלי חדש. סדר שבו אין עוד רוב ברור ואין מיעוטים ברורים. סדר שבו החברה הישראלית מורכבת מ4 מגזרים, ואם נרצה 4 שבטים מרכזיים שהם שונים במהותם, אלה מאלה שילכו ויתקרבו זה אל זה בגודלם. אם לא נצמצם את הפערים הנוכחיים בשיעור ההשתתפות בשוק העבודה וברמות השכר של הציבור הערבי והחרדי, שעתידים להיות מחצית מכוח העבודה, ישראל לא תוכל להמשיך ולהיות כלכלה מפותחת. הבורות ההדדית והיעדר שפה משותפת בין 4 המגזרים הללו, שהולכים ומדמים בגודלם, רק מגבירה את המתח, הפחד, העוינות והתחרות ביניהם. בשנה הראשונה לכהונתי פעלתי בניסיון לעורר כל צד בתוכנו, לראות את הצד האחר גם כשזה קשה. אני קורא היום לכולם, התגייסו יחד איתי לאתגר. אני שותף של כל מי שמוכן לתת את חלקו במשימה הזו. אני כאן לשירותכם, לשירותה של החברה הישראלית כולה. רק כך יחד ובשותפות נוכל לחדש תקווה ישראלית.
I would just maybe add to clarify maybe one thing about this amazing video. Why he came up with those four? Why is he looking at those four? Why we have numbers for those four tribes? Just remind everyone, is the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox Jews, the Datim Leumim, the nationalist religious Jews, the secular Jews, the Chilonim, and the Arabs. And it's not a random decision in the development of the country. They developed public education. Anyone can go for free to schools in Israel. And you can choose four options. You can have a school that is secular, or a school that is national religious, or a school that is ultra-Orthodox, or a school that is Arab. So that's how those four were decided. They existed already before the president came up as this division of sectors. And then we can know easily because we know how many are enrolled in those schools. And that's how the government have that kind of data about those four tribes and their relationship with education.
Thank you, Rav Natan. That's a very important explanation. One of the things I wanted to ask, why, according to these numbers, definitely allowing ourselves to know, like you said, with numbers, how many are enrolled, but also dividing a very general sectorial division that can sort of give a picture of what Israeli society is, especially with something that he mentioned of the division between the four. Now, my question for everyone, if you'd like to answer, is what are the main challenges that the President Rivlin brought up in his speech that we just saw that might occur in the future or even now with this distribution and distancing of the four tribes from each other?
I'm curious. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm curious what President Rivlin meant about we will cease to be, did he say developing or progressive nation? Was he suggesting that the growing populations would take the economy in a different direction?
So it's a great question, and we'll dive into that a little bit. Thank you, Laura. So he mentioned that in the future, not so far future, in the near future, the Arab population and the Haredi population are going to consist about 50% of the workforce in Israel. When we talk about these sectors specifically, we're talking about two tribes, let's call them tribes, out of the four, that in the educational system sometimes learn differently than in the general public institutions that are usually served mostly for the seculars, but also for the modern Orthodox. And also with the Haredi sector, with them studying, a lot of them studying Torah and not necessarily working, it affects the work, let's call it load, or distribution of funds, taxes, taxation, and other things in Israeli society. That affects the economy, that affects the progress in terms of development, as you mentioned, and opportunities in the Israeli society to grow more, as you know, startup nation and all the startups and innovation and everything might come to not a halt, but definitely a decrease in numbers of opportunities, mostly because of the distribution of the workload, but also the education system and the opportunities that are given in the different places and different sectors. We can talk about core studies, those main subjects that are studied in the schools that are not necessarily fully studied in the Haredi schools. So that also impacts how the progress of Israel is going to be in the future in that sense. Not only that, he mentioned something very important, the ignorance, the mutual ignorance. As a society, in order to continue growing positively, we need to combine together. We need to come together. We need to work together in all aspects. And once we have different conflicts within, it's very hard to continue growing positively as a nation. One of the greatest examples, only the past 2 years, we had 4 rounds of elections based mostly on the division of concepts, of ideologies, of agreement on different things. Most of them, at least those that led to the second and third round of elections, were around the issues of religion and state, and the distribution of forces within the political system, with Haredi parties, Orthodox parties, secular, pluralistic liberal parties, and also the Arab and Muslim parties in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament. So that rivalry, maybe, that could exist between the four tribes that are pulling in different directions, cannot help us grow, but only pull us away from growing, because we'll continue fighting within ourselves for the resources, for the budgets, for the grasp of seats and power in the parliament, instead of investing in the growth of the state.
I see that Ken has his hand up.
Thank you. Two quick questions. I heard a story this week about the Israeli athlete who won the gold medal in the Olympics, and that he is a Russian immigrant. He's Jewish, but because he's a Russian immigrant, he's considered an unreligious, or a person without religion, and therefore can't get married in Israel. Is he counted in those numbers as the secular, or is this some other total other category? The second question is, maybe this is a stereotype as I'm listening to the American press, but I always had the impression that the reason that many Arab Israelis lag in education is because less government money goes to Arab schools. There's less investment in Arab schools. Their access to schools is less than for Jewish kids. So those are my questions.
Wonderful questions. Wonderful questions. The first one is correct. As actually, we're going to see it later in our presentation, exactly this specific story. So we kind of got ahead of us, which was wonderful. But yes, it's correct. And he's counted with the others usually for the statistics that I presented. When it comes to the second question, it's exactly what I mentioned with the distribution of funds and budgets. It's also that. The investments of fund, by the way, right now, with the new budget coming and being approved hopefully soon, with the new government formed in Israel, a lot of budgets are going to the Arab tribe, let's call it that way, investing in that, investing in fighting in the crime with the within the Arab population in Israel, and investing more in development, not only with budgets for the school systems, but also in development for infrastructure in their areas, so they can have better existing conditions in general. But yes, it is a valid point that, yes, just like, by the way, not just the Arabs, if you talk about periphery and development towns and others, they receive less funds because each municipality receives funds from the state according to the size and the wealth. So the richer and bigger the area is, they get more money when they are already advanced, just like anywhere else, basically. So the gaps just become more and more present. Okay, so we're going to move on because we have a lot to cover. So these are the main four tribes. As we can see, I chose very stereotypical pictures. We are going to talk about stereotypes today, because this is what happens when you put a lot of different people together from different religions, from different cultures, from different countries. Just like we have here in the States, we have stereotypes about the different parts of the population. Israel is no different than other countries in that sense, and many, many other senses. This evening, we are going to focus mostly on 3/4, the 3/4 of those four tribes, just like the distribution that we have of four tribes. 3/4 of them are Jewish. We're going to focus a lot on the Jewish diversity in Israel. And we are going to talk about, of course, the Arab tribe and the others, if you may. So in the history of Jewish people in the land of Israel, up until the late 19th century, we had the Hayeshuv Yeshan, the old Jewish yeshuvas settling or living areas, mostly in four cities that were considered to be holy cities: Tzfat, Tveria, Tiberias, Hebron, and Yerushalayim. A lot of the Jewish population were in these cities and scattered around a little bit, a lot of Arab towns and villages in different places. And then came the end of the 19th century that brought a real change in the old Yishuv, in the Yishuv Yashan. Now, during this time, a lot of people who lived around those cities and other places in Israel, the Jewish people, a lot of them were Sephardic Jews. Sephardic meaning their origins were from Spain in 1492. The exile from Spain, they got scattered. Some of them went to Greece, Turkey, Egypt, other places. By the way, my last name is Ashkenazi. Ashkenazi, surprisingly, is a Sephardic name. Those Sephardic Jews who were exiled, who traveled through the area of Ashkenaz, which is the area of Germany, which was called Ashkenaz back then, when they arrived in Turkey, Egypt, other areas, they were called, because they came through Ashkenaz, they were named Ashkenazi. Last name was sort of a way to know where you were from. So my last name, Ashkenazi, is actually what we call Sfaradi Tahor, a pure Sephardic. I have pure Sephardic blood. And in my heritage, I also have a few chief rabbis in Israel, chief Sephardic rabbis, my great-great-great-grandfather and his son, and they actually lived in Jerusalem and founded one of the main hospitals who operated in the old city of Jerusalem from the 19th century, Misgav Ladach. Later on, 1948, after the war, it was moved into the new city of Jerusalem. So we had those. We had maybe a few Europeans, not really, the Ashkenazis, and some, let's call them, now we call them Mizrahi Jews, but let's call it the way it was, Arab Jews, the origins were from Yemen, other places, who traveled back in small numbers to the land of Israel. The main shift came around the beginning of the 1880s with the Aliyot, with those immigrations to Israel. So if you've seen this movie, and if you haven't, I really do recommend it, Fiddler on the Roof, one of the most beautiful Jewish stories of the Jewish shtetl, the Jewish village in Russia, which tells the story of tradition. By the way, I don't know if you know, but the fiddler, we can see right here in the back, this is the very final scene when they leave their village and start immigrating somewhere else. In this case, probably the Golden Medina, which was, of course, the United States. But the fiddler on the roof represents the conflict of Jewish people in Europe in late 19th century, early 1920s. And obviously, when this was written in the 20th century, it talked about this kind of wobbly person who stands between tradition and the new world and assimilation. 1881, the Desert Storm, so it was called, those pogroms that were targeting Russian Jews, a lot of anti-Semitism, a lot of attacks against Russian Jews, started immigrating to the United States and also to Israel. So they were basically running away or fleeing from those pogroms, but also some Russian Jews or Eastern European, not just Russian, made Aliyah for the longing for the land of Israel, for Zion. They wanted to go back to Zion. Most of them, middle class, about a quarter of them, settled in agriculture settlements and started working the land that was not very well developed that way back then, and started creating small Jewish villages. Those were the pilgrims, chalutzim, that worked in the early 20th century, worked the land in Israel, and slowly we got more and more of those groups who came and settled the land of Israel, Jewish people who came and settled. We're going to go through a timeline of the Aliyot in a second and talk about the different years, the characteristics of those groups who came from different parts of the world into the land of Israel. One thing that we're going to talk about also later, but one main thing that existed in this old land was the old city of Jerusalem that was surrounded with walls. And in the mid 19th century, actually started the new neighborhoods around the walls. At first, it was very, very hard because they were scared. They were scared of robbers. They were scared of wild animals that could be around. The walls kept them protected. Jewish people in the old city were Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardi Jews. It was a mixture of everyone around. Of course, the local Arab Jews, let's go like that way. But for many, many years, and still till today, the old city is made out of 4 quarters. We have the Muslim quarter right here in the north. We have the Christian quarter in the west, Jewish quarter, and Armenian quarter in the south. These quarters still do exist until this day, and we have people living there. But I just want to give you this this portion that also shows, if we talked about 4 tribes, those were the old 4 tribes: the Muslims, the Christians, Armenians, and Jews in the old city in Jerusalem. Now let's take another trip in history and take a look at this timeline. 1881, as I mentioned, there was the first Aliyah, what we call the first wave of Aliyah, lasted for about 20 years. Eastern Europeans mostly, but also some Yemenites for different reasons making Aliyah to the land of Israel. And as I mentioned, mostly fleeting pogroms, those who came from Eastern Europe were fleeting pogroms or had the longing to come to the land of Israel. And this was also an opportunity as an excuse to get there and started settling the land. And then we had the second wave of about 35,000 people, mostly, again, Eastern European people who came with ideology. 1897, Herzl created the first Zionist Congress. We have a lot of Zionist movements starting to come alive. If it's youth movements and others, we have a lot of Zionist activists, politicians, philosophers, and this feeling of Zionism is starting to grow within people, and people start thinking, we want to settle the land of Israel, go back to the land of our ancestors, and start doing that, starting to build more yishuvim, more small villages, and also the beginning of the kibbutzim, of those settlements that have socialist, almost communist, if you like, characteristics, coming, of course, from ideologies that they absorbed in Eastern Europe. The third wave of Aliyah came right after the First World War. Mostly, again, Eastern Europeans. The Western Europeans were more assimilated within their countries and were not pushed as much by those countries to leave the area. And the start of nationalism in the early 20th century made it more extreme, the pushing away of strangers or foreigners, including Jewish people, of course. We also know what happened, of course, later. The third Aliyah was mostly younger people who also grew up already within the Zionist movements and made it to Israel to settle the land in the kibbutzim and the different yeshuvim. Those members of this Aliyah, the third Aliyah, created the Haganah, one of the main underground movements that protected the Jewish towns, villages, kibbutzim, and also fought the British mandate for the independence of the state of Israel. And from the Haganah then grew the IDF. Those commanders and those who grew in the Haganah as a military organization founded the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, Tzahal, when came the day when the state was founded. The fourth Aliyah was mostly Eastern European, but also some from Yemen, Iraq, also the US. 1920s, we're talking about a depression. We're talking about longing to find different places. A lot of anti-Semitism in Europe, mostly. In the United States, they narrowed down the options of people immigrating into the United States, once again, because of the economy and the depression. So a lot of those who wanted to leave Europe and go to the United States couldn't, so they chose to travel to Israel. There's a beautiful saying that, at any point in history, Jewish people stood right in front of a boat and they had the option: get on the boat to go to the Golden Medina, the Golden State, the United States, or go to Israel. Some chose this and some chose that in many ways. 1930s, with the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany, the winds of war starting to happen in Europe, a lot of Europeans fled Europe and came to Israel, mostly into the more populated, bigger towns or even cities in Israel. Tel Aviv was founded in 1909, so by then it was already the first Hebrew city, so a lot came there. A lot of more educated Europeans came. So by the time that we reached 1948, the foundation of the state, we had a large population of European Jews who were more educated than those who came from the Arab countries in the area, were more educated in a lot of ways than those who lived in the old Yishuv, who lived in Israel even before all these aliyot, and they brought the change of spirit of Zionism, of agriculture, of technology, the technology that they had back then, all that to the development of the country, a lot of philosophy, literature, a lot of change. And with these days, we still have the Sephardic Jews. Now we have the Ashkenazi Jews. Ashkenazi is those who came from Europe. And those Ashkenazi Europeans referred to any Jewish person who came from an Arab country as a Mizrahi Jew. Now, Mizrahi means Eastern. But if we look at, for instance, Morocco, Algeria, Libya, they're not Eastern to Israel. They're Western to Israel. But they're still considered Eastern because they were East to Europe. So it's a very Eurocentric population right now that are trying to create and create the foundations for the new state. All of these Zionist operations and politics and diplomacy all happen in Europe and some in the United States, very Ashkenazi. So we have this hegemony of European Jews founding a new state, looking at the Mizrahi Jews as somewhat others, and talking about with the foundation, we're going to create a melting pot. Now, melting pot, we all know the term, the melting pot, and I do want to remind everyone, if you have a question or a comment, please jump right in at any point, because I can talk forever and ever, and we don't want just me talking. A melting pot is a concept that, doesn't really work. Some portion of something is going to take over even more. We can talk about the United States trying to be a melting pot. Is it really? We still have a lot of division here also. So this melting pot that David Ben-Gurion, who was a European Jewish person, the head of the Jewish Agency for Israel, when he announced the foundation of the State of Israel, later on became the first prime minister, he talked about a melting pot. But this melting pot, and we're going to talk about later, mostly meant, and I will say it in a blunt way, a de-Arabization of the Mizrahi Jews. And we're going to talk about it in a little bit. Continuing on with our timeline, 1948, the foundation of the state, waves of Aliyah. We saw the Declaration of Independence, right? The State of Israel will be open to all Jewish immigration. So slowly we're starting to absorb more and more Olim, more and more Jewish immigrants. 1949, 50,000 from Yemen in an operation that is called On Eagle's Wings, or the Magic Carpet. We can also see a very kind of Eastern, Middle Eastern reference here in the name itself, right? The Magic Carpet. Later on, Ezra and Nehemiah and Aliyah from Iraq in 1950, 1951. Ezra and Nehemiah were those who resettled the land of Israel from the Babylonians' exile, and actually brought to the foundation. So named after them, Ezra and Nehemiah was that operation. The Moroccan Aliyah, a big wave of it, happened in 1954, 1955. Now, the thing is, all these Arab countries and the waves of Aliyot came mostly, and these are not the only ones, came mostly because of a danger that happened, that occurred for the Jewish people there due to the establishment and the foundation of the State of Israel. The Arab nations did not want the State of Israel to exist, so they were very hostile towards their Jewish people in their countries, and a lot of them had to flee. So in 1949, the ruler of Yemen allowed the Jewish people from Yemen to leave, so they did that. Islam Nehemiah, Iraq, this was with the support of the United States of America. Ever since 1947, 29th of November 1947 was the night where the UN declared that they support the establishment of a Jewish state in Israel. Ever since that day, a lot of uprising against Jewish people in Iraq. So they outlawed any Zionist movement or congregating of Jewish people in Iraq. So they reached out, the Israeli government reached out to the United States to help them get those Iraqi Jews into Israel. And in exchange, those Iraqi Jews had to leave all of their possession behind to be dealt by Iraqi authorities, and to declare that they give up their citizenship and will never return to Iraq. And that was the deal. With Morocco, once again, targeting Jews since the beginning of the state of Israel. And this was a legal deployment of Jews out of Morocco in 1954. This is incorrect here. This is actually Morocco. But later on, this aliyah continued illegally in different ways with the help of the Jewish Agency for Israel, the Mossad. After it was founded, a lot of Jewish people were seeking the help of the Jewish state to come to Israel and to run away from attacks in their home countries, the Arab home countries. So they've continued to have waves of aliyah from Morocco throughout the years. For example, in 1961, a boat called Egoz with 43 people on it actually drowned on its way from Morocco to Israel. And it's one of those casualties and one of those terrible stories of aliyot that were illegal aliyot. Operation Achim. Operation Achim is actually made out of three main operations. Started in 1974, the aliyot of the Ethiopian Jews in different ways. The two big operations were in 1984, Operation Moses, Moshe, and Operation Shlomo, Solomon, in 1991. We're talking about 22,000 Ethiopian Jews. 1990 until 2000, about 1 million Russian or former Soviet Union Jews who immigrated to Israel after the falling of the USSR. And we also have big waves in the 1990s and early 2000s of South American or Latin American Jews into Israel, which mostly came, and Rav Natan maybe can explain more about that, due to economical stress and economical depression in those countries. Would you like to give us more information?
Sure. I'll share an anecdote that I shared earlier with Shai. I was while I was staying in Brazil, I was talking to the executive director of the Jewish Agency of the Safnut, who is in charge of Aliyah in Brazil and everything. That was already 6-7 years ago. And she was saying, you have no idea, we just hired the best professional to help us with the Aliyah, and the best thing, she's for free. And I was like, what do you mean? And then she said, oh, we got your president. I was like, what do you mean with that? Oh, the economy is so bad, everyone wants to make Aliyah. We tripled the numbers from last year. So that was the atmosphere already in Brazil years ago. And up to now, including during the pandemic, the numbers with the economic crisis are always rising. From my closest group of 10 friends, 3 of them already made Aliyah. Neither of them ever thought about that growing up, or if we had to guess which one of the 10 would be there, I would be the first, not them. And they happen to be the ones making Aliyah. And in Argentina, specifically in the 90s, there was a huge economical crisis. And many Jewish families, that was like, they didn't blink. They just went. Like all the savings were taken by the government. People lost like everything. And they had the Jewish state to protect them. Was just the immediate thought, a gut reaction, like, I have a safe haven to go to, I'm going. And a mass migration of Argentinians to Israel. There are still some little pockets and neighborhoods and synagogues where even the rabbis are Argentinian, and like those cities are known to have a big Spanish-speaking population, and so on.
Absolutely. Thank you for that important information. And like you said, this continues, and those pockets, there are kibbutzim that are Argentinian kibbutzim, and there are different places in Israel that are populated that way. And of course, we had those aliyot even before from all around. People kept on coming into Israel. By the way, before 1948, during the British Mandate, the British would not allow Jewish immigration into Israel to not upset the Arab population in the area. A lot of people were ma'apilim. La'apil is pilgrimage, and they were illegally brought by the movements to the shores of Israel. A lot of those ships were captured, and they were sent to Cyprus to be in detention centers or camps. We're talking also after the Holocaust and throughout the 1940s. Fighting for the right of immigration to their land in a way. And one that I do want to mention that's not here, we're going to talk about it a little bit later. Throughout the years, also American Jews came to Israel and from other places as well. And between 1917 and 1922, about 4,000 Jewish people came from the United States to Israel. In the early 30s, about 4,000 more. And from the beginning, from the foundation of the state up until now, we're talking about another 140,000 Americans who came to live in Israel. Numbers change all the time. Out of all of these people who moved to Israel from different countries throughout all these aliyot and everything, not everyone stayed in Israel. Of course, some went back to their origin countries if they could and if they wanted. There were also large waves in the past 2 decades of French immigration and other countries. A lot moved instead of going back to where they were, maybe to the United States. We know there are a lot of Israelis here in Northern Virginia. We have a large Israeli population in our area and a lot of places around the United States. Another map I want to show you quickly is the numbers of Jewish people in the Arab world prior to 1948 and the Declaration of Independence, and up until today. After the Declaration, about 800,000 Jewish people left those countries, fled the Arab countries, moved into Israel due to the anti-Semitism or due to being persecuted by the establishments in those countries. So we're talking about the melting pot.
May I ask,
Sylvia,
from the Arab countries, did they jump or were they pushed?
So it's both. As I mentioned, in Yemen, it was sort of encouraged by the rulers. You can go if you wish. We don't want you here. You have your own country. In Iraq, for example, it was an operation that was by Israel and the United States due to the terrible conditions they lived in as they were persecuted and targeted. Morocco as well, they were targeted in many ways. Iran back then, in Syria, a lot of, and all others that we see here. Once the Jewish state was established, we had, the Arab nations were against it, and they were united in the decision that they were not going to give the Jewish an easy time with the establishment of a new country, and that pushed people out. Even if the countries didn't necessarily say leave, they definitely pushed them out, even if they didn't encourage it specifically. So we're talking about this melting pot. We're talking about all these diasporas coming together. And there's this wonderful song that tells the story of the aliyot that I would like to share with you. We're going to hear not the entire song, but most of it. And you have the lyrics right here to follow.
שונות רבות מספור דיברנו, וזה את זה כמעט בכלל שלא הכרנו, ומקומות רבים מאוד עזבנו, ורק מקום אחד רצינו ואהבנו, ומקומות רבים מאוד עזבנו, ואל הארץ, אל הארץ באנו. ונמשכת שיירה שעבר. רחוקים כבר היוצאים, עיקרים וחלוצים, שעמלו עבדו בפרך בלי לראות את סוף הדרך. ועכשיו עוברים אנחנו, לא שקטנו ולא נחנו, לא ימשיכו בלעדינו, זוהי הרפתקת חיינו. מגטאות ומחנות הגחנו, אל הביצות ואל הישימון הלכנו, מקצות ערב מרוסיה ופולניה, הדלקנו אור גם בדימונה גם בדגניה. מקצות ערב מרוסיה ופולניה, הדלקנו אור גם בדימונה גם בדגניה. ומכל הגלויות ועם כל הבעיות.
Okay, so we don't have time to listen to the entire song, but here, they mentioned the different countries from Romania and Russia, Poland, Arabia, all the different countries we came. And this tells us, it's a very Zionistic song. It tells the story of, we had those pilgrims who came before us a century ago or decades ago, and this is our turn to join them to build the country. And they mention, we built Dimona and Gania. Dimona, a very small development town or a small city in the Negev in the south of Israel. And Gania is in the north of Israel and is a kibbutz, the first kibbutz. These two, I don't know if they were chosen specifically and intentionally in the song, but these two actually represent almost two opposites of Israeli society in many ways. And I'm going to share why. We talked about the Ashkenazi hegemony. We talked about those Olim who built the kibbutzim. Dgania is the first kibbutz, a new social life in the land of Israel, which is supposed to be a symbol of the resurrection of the Jewish people. And Dimona was built much later. Dimona was built on something that we're going to talk about now. And we're talking about the tension between the Ashkenazi Jews. I talked about that melting pot and the hegemony. And the state was founded mostly by Ashkenazi Jews who came in all those waves of aliyot since 1881 till 1948. And now we have a state and we have waves of thousands, dozens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people with different cultures. So what do you do when you're a young state? You don't have the infrastructure, you don't have the buildings, you don't have the roads, you don't have the towns, the villages, the systems to deal with this. They built transition camps, ma'abarot. Ma'abarot comes from the word ma'avar, transition camps. This is what the transition camps looked like. Big tents, no infrastructure whatsoever, and everyone were put in it. If they came from Hungary, if they came from Iraq, if they came from Yemen, or if they came from Russia. This is what the state could offer. And at this point, I think David Ben-Gurion and some other people said, oh my God, what have we done? We said we're open for everyone, but what are we going to do? So this was an initial solution. Later on, these became huts. Those tents were taken away, replaced by tin huts in different places. And during all this time, they were talking about how to improve the lives of these Olim. Now you can see a lot of documentaries that talk about the Ma'abarot and the trauma that people suffered there. The main difference between the Ashkenazis who made it to the Ma'abarot, who made Aliyah, who came to the transition camps, and those Mizrahi Jews who came from the Arab countries, there were a few differences. One, those who came from Russia were more educated. From Europe were more educated. They also spoke Yiddish. And the Ashkenazi hegemony in Israel spoke Yiddish. It's so easy to communicate, right? So when they came to the transition camp and they wanted to check them for any lice or pests, or they wanted to spray them with disinfectants, they could explain to them what they are going to do. When a Jewish person from an Arab country comes and does not speak Yiddish or Hebrew, and those Ashkenazi doctors or nurses did not speak their language, they could not explain the process they were going to go through. So it was traumatizing for them. Also, the fact that the European Jews had some family maybe already settled here for a decade or two, helped them find a job, helped them go through the system quicker and easier. They understood more bureaucracy than those who came from Arab countries. So they were able to leave the transition camps sooner and move to the shikunim. The shikunim are the buildings that were later on built. And for Mizrahi Jews, what we later called Mizrahi, they were left behind in a way, in many ways, in the ma'abarot, in the transition camps for a longer time. Those transition camps slowly were built with shikunim, in other ways, turned into development towns. Most of them in the desert, because that was a huge portion of the land, the south of Israel, the Negev, a huge portion of the land that had the space to contain all the transition camps, and they just remained where they were and created basically around them those new towns. So Dimona is one of them, for example, from the song. Other ones are Sderot. If you hear about Sderot, that is very close to Gaza, you hear about shooting rockets at Sderot, is one of them. Ofakim, a lot of different ones. Also, not just in the Negev, it was also in Jerusalem, some neighborhoods, also in the north of Israel, different places. And the gap between the Ashkenazi Jews who quickly adapted into the new society because of the language, the skills, the education, and those of the Arab Jews who came from the different countries, the gap started to grow bigger and bigger. And in many, many ways, I mentioned it, I think, a little bit before, there was a process of unofficial de-Arabization of the Mizrahi Jews. Rav Natan, you wanted to
I just want to point out something also related to what Ken asked earlier about support from the government to schools, right? What the kind of support of government look like in that moment. And if you ever been to Israel, you went to Ben Gurion Center in the Negev and you watch all the videos about his vision for Israel, you're going to remember they had a major vision about the Negev. Ben Gurion said he actually himself, at the end of his life, moves to a kibbutz and settles the Negev. The Ashkenazim of Tel Aviv, who were all in the power, right? There was no Mizrahi people in the leadership of the country at that time. They thought that the Negev needs to be settled, just not by them, but it needs to be settled, right? They're not moving from Tel Aviv.
Absolutely.
It needs to be settled, right? So having all the Ashkenazic educated leadership in the major cities, of course, saw that as an opportunity. These people, they come from places that are desert. They know how to survive in the desert. They had no idea what the Mizrahim looked like, thought like, nothing, right? It's a complete separate world. If you think that now the tribes don't really know each other, imagine a Polish immigrant who only know Poland and Tel Aviv, and they're studying how a Yemenite is going to survive in Dimona, right? It has no idea. And that played an important role that most of the cities that Shai is mentioning were completely separate. Ashkenazim integrated and went to the major cities, and the Mizrahis were left in those development towns.
Absolutely. Thank you for that explanation. That's very important. Maybe I left some of those details behind. I want to share something else. There's a wonderful movie called Salach Shabbati, a comedy, a satire about Israeli society those days, was written by Ephraim Kishon, a Hungarian Jew. And in that, you see the star of the story, the main character is Salach Shabbati. He came from Morocco with his, I think, 9 children. He came to the Ma'abara, to the transition camp. His best friend there, by the way, is Polish, and they play backgammon, sheshbesh all day long. That's what they do. And you can see how the Ashkenazi hegemony, they just don't understand at all those who came from Morocco and other places. So they try to manipulate the Mizrahi Jews a little bit for their advantages. They call them barbaric, but also this Mizrahi Jew, the Moroccan Jew, looks at them with the kibbutz, and he says, one of the members of the kibbutz wants to marry his daughter, Salah Shabadi's daughter, and there's a whole conversation whether the kibbutz will allow it or not, and they give them an apartment or not. And he says, so what, my daughter is going to belong to the kibbutz now? I don't understand how it works. And all the Ashkenazis, those who founded the state and the kibbutzim, are shocked when they see them. How do you not understand our culture? There are elections, and he's encouraged to vote in the elections, which he's never done before, but nobody explains the bureaucracy and how it works. It adds up that he manipulates everyone to his advantage because he's smarter than everyone, and the joke is on them. But that is a wonderful movie that shows this transition and the gap between the cultures in a humoristic way. So we talked about those Ma'abarot, we talked about this. The Mizrahi Jews are left behind. The Ashkenazi Jews keep on progressing, and in the 1970s, this symbol comes up. Does anyone recognize this symbol?
Black Power.
Black Power. In the 60s, the symbol of what movement? In the United States?
Several.
Was it John
Several.
Carlos?
Black Panthers.
Yeah, John Carlos, who showed the symbol at the Olympics.
Yeah, we had that. So the Black Fist of the Black Panthers. In the 1970s, a group of young Mizrahi Jews in Jerusalem, by the way, in a neighborhood called Musrara. Musrara was a teeny tiny transition camp bordering Rechavia. If you wanted to hear something that's absurd, that is exactly it. You have Musrara, a teeny tiny transition camp that later on turned into a neighborhood, all populated by mostly Moroccan but other Mizrahi Jews. No infrastructure, sewage in the street, no money, no proper living conditions, bordering with Rechavia. Rechavia is where the official residence of the president of Israel is, of the prime minister, where the president of the Hebrew University lived, where Yitzhak Ben Tzvi, who was the second president of Israel, lived on his private residence. All the top of the crop of Israel lived there, bordering with this Ma'abara. Now, those days were the days where the Jewish agency would bring food to different populations. We had the milkman going and putting milk on the doors in Rechavia. You would have food brought there. Those young people said, we want the milk. Nobody brings us milk. So they went and stole the milk and brought it to the children in Musrara. They stole Jewish agency food that was meant for different people to bring it to their people who had no food. They started the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers became a political and social movement of young Mizrahi Jews who called for a change in their conditions to be considered as equals. We see this shirt says Black Panther right here. This on top here is from a newspaper. It says, fight poverty, not the poor. Because they were targeted by the police as felons. When we have nothing, we need to steal to have. We're criminals now. So they're being arrested. They have a record. They have a problem getting jobs. We know this cycle from so many other places. We know how it works. Golda Meir, who was the prime minister back then, actually met representatives of the Black Panthers for a meeting to see what they want. What do they want the government to do? The only thing, when she was asked about this meeting by the media, the only thing she said was, they weren't very nice. That's the only thing she said about that meeting. So in this small photo down here of a protest, there's a sign that says, Golda, teach us Yiddish. Because apparently we need to speak Yiddish in order to get along in the state of Israel. This was a main fight of oppression against Mizrahi Jews. And this was also brought in so many ways. I work a lot with music and talk about Israel through music. Mizrahi music, any Jewish-speaking music that came from Mizrahi Jews that had some Arab sounds was only played 1 hour a week on the radio. When there were music and song festivals in the 70s for the entire country, they didn't include any Mizrahi music. Later on, they decided to create another festival for Mizrahi music separately, not with everyone. And that was broadcast in the 1 hour a day on TV that was dedicated to shows on the one channel that Israel had. Again, the main public music festival that had no Mizrahi music was broadcast on Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel's Independence Day. It was a glorious thing. The Mizrahi one was saved for almost a decade for the 1 hour a week and during the year. I mean, every week there was an hour dedicated for Arab television, but that once a year festival was broadcast in this time, separating Ashkenazi and Mizrahi. Now, last time when we were here, Jean mentioned something about Mizrahi Jews maybe trying to push away their identity. I can tell you that these days in Israel, and also here, they took pride of who they were and said, we are who we are, we're proud of it, we just want equality. These days, Mizrahi music is one of the top earning music in Israel. Mizrahi musicians are top earners. They are the big stars. Mizrahi Jews have a lot of pride and are doing very well. There is some separation in some areas as well, and some sort of racism, I will say it bluntly, in that way, in that separation of Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Jews. And Sephardic and Mizrahi almost got twisted and mingled together, even though there's still a different concept of what they are. So we're talking about a melting pot that is not a real melting pot. It's just a bunch of different groups trying to get along, living together. Rav Natan and I talked today, and we talked about, he asked, do we have like a number of how many Mizrahi Jews there are in Israel, how many Ashkenazi, how many Sephardic? And it's impossible to know today because everyone got mixed together in marriage in different ways, so you can't count. Me, for example, I mentioned before, I'm Sephardic, but on my father's side, my grandfather, his father, and those originated centuries ago from Spain, but my grandfather's mother came from Morocco. His father was born in Israel. My grandmother on my father's side came from Syria, and on my mother's side, I'm Swiss and Polish. So it's all mixed together. I'm Israeli, right? So there are still cultural differences in many ways, but to identify and say this one's Sephardic, this one's Mizrahi, this one's Ashkenazi, unless they're directly married only within the communities of the same ethnicity or Edah, we wouldn't know at all. I mentioned the Aliyah or Aliyot from Ethiopia before, and I want to stop, kind of focus on that because Ethiopians are
one second before I go to Ethiopia, I see a question from Naomi.
Yep. Oh, I'm sorry. It's impossible for me to see everyone, so I apologize.
So I'm just curious. So now that there's a lot of, well, I use the term intermarriage, so you can't really distinguish. But I think that, so now it's more like fundamentalism, Judaism, and there's still there's more separation that's really more difficult than what you look like, because after so many years, there's a distinct Israeli culture that goes across everything, but the religion, I think, is more separated.
Exactly. Thank you for that point, because
I just want to give one quick example about something interesting, especially for conservative movement, if you think religiously. Every Siddur, every prayer book you have, it has a nusach. Nusach is where it comes from, what kind of liturgy is in there. The Sephardic prayer book is different than the Ashkenazic. The order of the prayers are different. Some prayers, the language is different, right? They are really different. And you have also the Edot Mizrach, the Mizrahi version as well. Within Ashkenazic, you have Ashkenazic. So you have multiple versions of Siddurim. They're not all the same. The conservative movement is a reflection of the modern Israeli society. You have Americans who made Aliyah, who bring that Ashkenazic conservative movement, as we know in this country. But at the same time, you have people from all kinds of life in Israel joining it. And then the new Siddur that came out, Vanit Filati, by the conservative movement, it says that this is Nusach Israeli. This is a Israeli Siddur. This is not Ashkenazic. This is not Sephardic. We can't differentiate. Our Siddur has everyone. And it's going to have things that is going to be more like one and more like another. So there is a major tradition, mostly in Sephardic congregations, to sing Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, before Kabbalat Shabbat, Friday night. Between Mincha and Mariv, they do Shir, some the whole thing, some just selections. There are some conservative Masorti communities in Israel that are doing that with Sephardic melodies, right? And the American is who made Aliyah is there in the same synagogue, and all of that really comes together. And as Naomi was saying, the some of those differences still exist, and we're going to talk about some of them still, but some of them were completely integrated in some way here and there. And what divides people is not exclusively Mizrahi, Ashkenazic, Sephardic, but how religious you are. Are you more that kind of religion or this kind of religious, and so on.
Absolutely.
Back
Thank
to
you for that.
Ethiopia.
And Anif Kilatiz, great. Yep. Before that, I do want to say that Naomi takes us back to the 4 tribes. When Ruby Rivlin, when the president talks about Israeli society, it doesn't talk about Mizrahi, Sephardic, Ashkenazi, Ethiopian, Russian. He talks about secular, Orthodox, or as we call it, Dati, religious, even though it's a very different thing, and Haredi. So a spectrum of religiosity in Jewish population. And this is what we talk about in the separation today in Israeli society, not necessarily the origins, the country origins, because for each one of those groups, you can find all of the populations we're talking about now. You can find secular Mizrahi, you can find Haredi Mizrahis, you can find ultra Orthodox, whoever, from all different types of countries and in the mixture with that. I do want to bring now, and we're talking about different populations, one that does stand out because it's a newer aliyah in a way, and is definitely the Ethiopian one. If you have yet to watch, and I definitely recommend to watch the Red Sea Diving Resort on Netflix. Tells an amazing heroic story, focusing more on the Mossad and Israel than the Ethiopians who actually initiated this operation in 1974. But the stories of the Aliyot from Ethiopia are incredible and heroic. They included wandering in the desert from Ethiopia to Sudan, being in refugee camps for many years, and then getting to Israel through rescue missions that went along for many, many years. But Beit Israel, which was the Jewish Ethiopian community, made the biggest aliyah was in 1990, 1991 with Operation Solomon Shlomo, brought a different integration in Israeli society, brought a new, and I have to say it out loud, a racial complexity in Israeli society. And it also comes to what Naomi stated before of, who's Jewish, who's not Jewish, how Jewish, are you Jewish? It goes to what Ken talked about before with the Russian immigration as well, that was in the early 1990s until 2000 with 1 million people who immigrated. The main question now when people integrated is, how Jewish are you? And for example, with the Ethiopian Jews, only a few years back, one of the vineyards, the biggest vineyards in Israel, decided they're letting go some of the mashgichim, the kashrut mashgichim, from their vineyard or some of their employees, because the rabbinate, the rabbinical institute, wasn't certain how Jewish they were, which will compromise the kashrut for their wine. And we're talking about one of the employees who was ultra-Orthodox, was wearing a black yarmulke, a suit, tzitzit, everything ultra-Orthodox, and the rabbinut were not sure how Jewish he was. So after that, it was a huge scandal, but the vineyard, that company, took it back and re-employed everyone and apologized. But this is only one of those things that is to be considered now in Israeli society. Now, these Ethiopian Jews who came to Israel, in a lot of ways, we're talking about, people, we can call them Jews of color, black people in a mostly whiter society, had a harder time to find who to relate to. So they did relate to more Mizrahi Jews. They were placed in absorption centers, mostly in the periphery. So also, like the Mizrahi Jews, didn't necessarily get all the initial great starting points. And in the 1990s and early 2000s, you could see a lot of them finding a lot of emotions that relate to mostly Northern American pop culture, Black pop culture, with hip hop, with or Jamaican or anything of that sort, with reggae, with the music, with the way they dressed and how they behaved. And in the past decade or so, a lot of them are returning to their roots even more. At first, they were somewhat ashamed of, their parents who had a hard time studying Hebrew. They wanted to be like others. They were finding the way. Now they're returning to their roots a lot more, and with the pride for Ethiopia. And there is a wonderful young Ethiopian poet who wrote a poem that it is an apology to Ethiopia for forgetting or maybe pushing it away from her, and now she's returning to it, which is a beautiful sentiment. But Ethiopian Jews also brought something beautiful in the culture, and every aliyah brought something, right? With the culture, with the knowledge. The Russian aliyah brought a lot of doctors and engineers and other things. One of the greatest things that we have in Israel is Israeli food that is a mixture of everything that's great around the world. But you might have heard of Idan Reichel, an amazing Israeli musician who took Ethiopian music and sampled it into his own music. Let's hear a part of his song, Mima Amakim, from the depth.
ሸባል አገር ልጅ የምታምር ሰው ናት እሷም ልጅን የምልጅ ትርጋቡ ይሉናል የተሰቀለውን ማን ያወርድልናል ናኖ ናኖ ነይ ናኖ ናኖ ነይ ካንቻለኝ ጉዳይ ናኖ ናኖ ነይ ናኖ ናኖ ነይ ካንቻለኝ ጉዳይ ממעמקים קראתי אלייך בואי אליי בשובך יחזור שוב האור בעיניי.
So Idan Reichel wrote this beautiful love song that is based on some biblical references. ממעמקים קראתי אלייך, ממעמקים קראתי חיה, biblical references in a lot of his songs. And he decided to take and give place and room to this beautiful Ethiopian culture. Let's listen to the original Ethiopian song that is a love song. I don't exactly know the lyrics, but I don't think it speak the language, but it is an Ethiopian love song. Let's hear the original that he took into his own song. So this is just one example of how the cultures in Israel mix together and really enrich everything and bring a new fusion or a new culture in Israel. Oh, I started going crazy. Now, we talked about those. Let's talk a little bit about Americans, or as we call them, in Israel, we put them together in an Anglo aliyot or societies. Anglo is usually more, the term Anglo more refers to British, maybe Australian, but in Israel, all these English speakers are Anglos for us. Large, over 150,000 Americans in Israel made aliyot throughout the years. Some of them are in blocks in Jerusalem, Ra'anana, different places. A lot of them, by the way, because English is such a strong language and everyone studies English in school, television, music, movies, everything. Israel is very Americanized. it's very easy for them to not even bother to study, to learn how to speak Hebrew. I personally know some children who were born in Israel into American households at the age of 10 still could not really speak Hebrew because they go to English speaking kindergartens and other frameworks and establishments, so they kept with that. So that really affects Israel a lot, and the Americanization of Israel. Looking always, big sister, United States of America, we can see something interesting. These companies that we see here, these signs, all Israeli. However, the sign is in English. Why? Because of course it looks more prestige. It looks better in English, even though onot means seasons in Hebrew, but the sign is not in Hebrew. And that is despite a law that every sign of a Hebrew word in the store is supposed to be big letters in Hebrew and smaller in English if they want. It's a part of the law in Israel because of the official language and the tapestry of the state. However, nobody really cares about it too much. So we have this, but we also have all these American outfitters, Burger King, McDonald's, the kosher McDonald's parts of it, Urban Outfitters, all these American brands that made their way into Israel due to the Americanization of Israel in many ways. Official languages Hebrew is the official language in Israel. Arabic has a special place, but other than that, English is not really an official language. In the Mandate time, the British Mandate time, it was decided, and there was a law that any sign, street signs or others, should have 3 languages at least: Hebrew, Arabic, and English. And this is what happens in most places. Yes, Ken, please.
Well, what happened to Yiddish in all of this? Was Yiddish actively suppressed, or was it just
so
behind, or what?
With the rebirth of Hebrew and everything, Yiddish remained mostly for the ultra-Orthodox, and it's a forgotten language. There's a Yiddish Spiel theater that is active in some capacity. Some people still speak it a little bit or study it, but it's a forgotten language, like Ladino, by the way. If you've heard of Ladino,
Yes.
Ladino is the Sephardic Yiddish, right? Almost long gone as well. That is a part of that melting pot.
Maybe I'll just add, there was a big debate in the creation of the state of Israel. If you go back to the 30s and 40s as we're talking, what would be the language, right? And Zionism in this idea of returning to our historical home brought with it the idea of returning to our historical language as well. There were people saying not just Yiddish should be the language, some saying German should be the language, for a basic reason. That was the most common language that people would know. Probably many of them spoke German among themselves because we're talking about the leadership of Ashkenazim, which German was the common language, not English at that time, right? So they had those debates, they were open, and thanks God, Hebrew won.
Absolutely, I agree. So a little bit, and we have to jump along because I don't want to hold us too long tonight. We talked about the religion in Israel, and religion and state situation. So if we look at the Masorti movement, and now it's interesting, the Masorti movement is the conservative movement. However, if you ask people if they are Masorti, the word in Hebrew is traditional. Masorti means traditional. It's a whole different thing. People consider themselves to be Masorti also, which is not conservative. So the conservative movement and reform movement made Aliyah as well with European Jews and American Jews to Israel. As of today, there are about 50 reform communities, and about 8% of the Israelis, Jewish Israelis, consider themselves reform. Some consider themselves reform and do not belong to these reform communities. And almost 80 conservative communities and about 5% of Israelis consider themselves conservative. And I mentioned here Women of the Wall. If you've heard of them since the early 90s, every Rosh Chodesh and holidays, every beginning of the Jewish month, they go to the Western Wall, they pray there with the Sidurim and the Torahs. A lot of controversy there because the Kotel, the Western Wall, is ruled in a way by ultra-Orthodox authority that will not allow women to pray that way in the wall. So there's a lot of controversy over there. Another issue is conversion. Who is allowed to conduct conversion in Israel? For the rabbinate, the ultra-Orthodox or the Orthodox rabbinate has almost the monopoly. If you were converted outside of Israel by a Reform rabbi or a conservative rabbi, you're considered Jewish and can make aliyah and have the right of return. If you were converted in Israel by a Reform or conservative rabbi, you're not considered converted. In many ways, it is now changing in some ways with different laws. There are a lot of debates about that. And if you can see, Reconstructionism, for example, is not a word that is used in Israel whatsoever. You cannot find any, even though there are small, teeny tiny groups, but it's so minuscule, people do not even know how to pronounce that word. So this is about
I'll just,
that a little bit.
Let me just add one
please.
thing, Shai. That thing you just shared, that conversion made by conservative or Reform rabbi in Israel, as of, I think, 2 months ago or something like that, now they're legal. It's one of the latest decisions. The Supreme Court had a ruling on that. I think, of course, Shah's still going to appeal, and there's still a long way to go. But as of right now, it's one of the things that has changed. And in general, the conservative movement is and the Reform are very, very excited with this new government. All the Kotel agreement and everything sounds like a common sense within the new coalition, and probably will move forward. One thing that really help is that now we have a Reform rabbi as part of the coalition, right? Out of the 61 Knesset members who formed the coalition, the government, one of them is a Reform rabbi, Rabbi Gilad Kariv. He was the head of the Reform movement for many, many years in Israel, and now left that job to become a member of the Knesset. And he's very, very involved with the conversations and everything about more than 10% of Israel identify with those two streams. And if you look at the next slide that Shai is going to present, we're going to see it's somehow more than the Haredim. How can it be that the Haredim have that amount of power, right? And the Reform and Conservative together don't, if we're actually more than them. And that's the ongoing conflict about that.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I did mention that Supreme Court and everything, because like you said, any law or decision by the Supreme Court can still change by a certain law that would come in the parliament that would change everything and can outlaw it in many ways. Right now, the entire kashrut mandate that the Rabbinical Institute has is also maybe going to change and open it up a little bit more to have Reform, conservative, or any other type of kashrut that is supervised by the Rabbinical Institute, but people will not have to pay them. That's a whole different story of religion state that we're not going to go into. This is somewhat of a distribution. We talked about traditional masorti, not in the conservative movement way, but this is sort of a distribution of Jewish people in Israel and how they view themselves religiously, where secular, traditional, religious, what is religious, all those terms are very different than here in the United States. But also we see the Haredim, about 11%, very small percentage, a lot of power. Though that is due to the status quo, that's a whole different, maybe one day we'll have a religion and state session. Nathan, what do you say?
I'm all in, and maybe just to connect that with some of the things we have talked about today, the Haredim, they're mostly Ashkenazic, not 100%. You can see a Sephardic person dressing up like a Polish person of the 18th century. It happens. But it's mostly an Ashkenazic thing. The Sephardic world didn't live through the Enlightenment in Europe, which is what created the Haredi world, right? There are no Sephardic Haredi rabbis historically. Some of them are this new thing that happens here in America and in Israel. While the traditional, the Masorti, as Shai was explaining, is majority Mizrahi, right? It's hard to find an Ashkenazi Jew who's gonna say, "Oh yeah, I'm Masorti," meaning I keep Shabbat, I keep Kashrut, but I live like out there. That's more in the Mizrahi Sephardic world, less in the Ashkenazic, which is also heavier in the secular world, right? The secular is heavier Ashkenazi than the others. Nothing of that is monolith or 100%, but it has to do with the Aliyot and how religion played a role in the countries where they're coming from, right? If you think about the Ashkenazi experience in Europe with Christians and the role of the universities and getting secular and getting out in the big cities and all of that, there is a role that never happened in the Sephardic countries where they are mostly Muslim countries, where everyone is religious, where that secular place of society is not as big. Democracy is not necessarily a thing. So it really has to do with their upbringing. And now I think this next generation is when everything starts to get together in some way and lose its roots in some way. But it's still historically, some of those are related to the origins as well.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you for adding that, because I was just about to trying to I was trying to think of how to explain traditional in the right way. And the interesting thing is that the Masorti, the traditional, is very different from one person to another. As Rav Natan said, in the Mizrahi Jews and others, when we didn't have the Enlightenment, being Jewish was by just being Jewish. You keep kosher, you observe Shabbat or don't, but to an extent, you know those things, you celebrate the holidays. Traditional is very different. I consider myself traditional. I don't keep Shabbat, I keep Kashrut, I fast on Yom Kippur, I celebrate all the holidays. But another friend of mine might say, oh, this is, you fast on Yom Kippur and you keep Kashrut, you're more than just traditional. Another person, you say, you call yourself traditional? I'm traditional, and I observe Shabbat, and I'm kasher lemehadrin, right? I'm ultra kosher, and that's traditional. So it's a spectrum that's so hard to identify. With the Haredim, it's interesting because you have three types of Haredim. You have the Lita'im, those who are, the Yiddishkeit European ones. You have the Hasidim, who follow the Rebbes, who have the courts of certain Rebbes that they follow for their guides. And you do have the Sephardic ones, but that is also as a reaction, like Rav Natan said, the Orthodoxy is a reaction to the Reform in Europe, 100 and something years ago. And in Israel, the Sephardic or Mizrahi ultra-Orthodoxy also started as a reaction to secularity and all that, and formed, for example, Shas, one of the biggest, the strongest ultra-Orthodox parties in the Knesset, is a Sephardic or ultra-Orthodox party. So we talk about those tribes, and we talk about all this. This is, for example, if we talk about the tension between one another, this is Ezrat Klal Yisrael. It's an area in the southern part of the Western Wall, not where the big part of the Western Wall where everyone prays. This is what Rav Natan talked about, the Kotel settlement. This portion is designated for egalitarian prayers. It was supposed to be bigger. They're now going to see if it will be bigger or not. It's not super accessible, I have to say, and you cannot really touch the wall. There is a gap there. This is like a big platform that was built on ruins in order to create a compromise of an egalitarian prayer section. Right here we see a mechitza, which is not originally there. So the tension that we have now in Israel is that the Orthodoxy will not accept Reform and conservative Judaism, and to spite them, they would come and take over this portion of the wall sometimes and put a mechitza and say, everyone can pray here. This is a Klal Yisrael for all of Israel to pray here. According to their customs, this is our custom. So not really allowing that. So that is one of the things that maybe with this government will change and allow to give. One of the things in this compromise with this area was to give a complete control of this area to the conservative and Reform movements in Israel. Right now, it is still being ruled by the Orthodoxy, which is a problem. To some, not to all, but it is.
Just to add a personal story, the first time I was there in Ezrat Yisrael, that platform didn't exist. It was Shavuot 2008, and we were sitting on the stones on the floor, like down there, right? So there was nothing. There was no bench, no bima, nothing. We're really sitting on the 2,000 old stones that are left there in the archaeological site, right? And so there is a lot of developments, one over the other. Recently, the last time I lived there was 3 years ago. We actually could get to the wall. If you go to the left of this picture here, as you can see, there is actually an access towards the wall. And recently, a huge stone fell off very, very top. And there was one woman praying in that space, and thanks God she was okay, nothing hit her or anything. So right now they blocked that area and you can only stay in that major plaza that you can see. And this is part of this Kotel agreement that is being discussed, is maybe that stone fell because there was no regular maintenance there, and there's not enough protection to see what's happening there. And one of the major asks is that it's going to be secure, and the entrance is going to be in the same level. So a regular person who comes can look to both options and make their decision, instead of being the main plaza and a segregated area that is less off. And really recently in Tisha B'Av, actually, we had a huge fight in that area where Orthodox groups came before the people came. And there is a tradition to use this place to do a conservative movement-wide Megillah reading on Tisha B'Av. And there's a limit, I think, of 400 people that can stay in that platform. So they were almost taken by the Orthodox, and for safety, the conservative people said, please wait, let us try to take these people out so more people can come in. Huge thing. And one very interesting thing that it caused is that there are some Haredi, some ultra-Orthodox rabbis coming out in support of Reform and Conservative and saying that the Orthodox should not say things against them. They are still Jews, and you should love all the Jews. The most famous one is Rabbi Eliezer Melamed. I have some of his halacha books here with me in the office. And he's the Rosh Yeshiva of Har Bracha, a very important yeshiva in Efrat. And this is gonna start changing things, right? In some sense, was good that it happened because it provoked people to talk more about that, and might even help move faster with all disagreements.
Absolutely, and the thing is, it's really hidden right now. If you go to the main plaza of the Kotel, you will not even know that this exists. And with the big stone that fell, depends on who you ask. It's either maintenance, or, if you ask the ultra-Orthodox, it's because people were praying over there in the wrong way. So this is a part of state and religion here. Another thing that Ken mentioned before, Artem Dolgopiat, the new winner of the gold medal representing Israel in gymnastics, came from the former USSR, and because of that, many of them are not considered fully Jewish. They need to bring a lot of documents to prove that they are actually Jewish, and if they're not fully Jewish, they cannot get married in Israel properly, because there is no civil marriages in Israel. If people want to get married not by a rabbi, or if they cannot get married because we're talking about same-sex marriage, or one of the partners is not Jewish. In Israel, by the way, we can only have religious marriage, even if you're a Christian or Muslim or whatever. You have to be married by an ordained representative of your religion. So there are no real reform or conservative marriages. By the way, a few years back, a conservative rabbi was actually arrested for conducting a wedding.
You were muted for maybe the last 5 seconds. We couldn't hear anything.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I was saying that because he's not considered fully Jewish, he cannot get married in Israel as of now, which is something that, if we talked about prior elections and everything, one of the things that they're trying to really fight in legislation in Israel. So another aspect of Jewishness in Israel, this is a synagogue of Abba Yudea. Abba Yudea is a Jewish tribe in Uganda. They were converted to Judaism in 1919, but they're not considered fully Jewish. An interesting thing is, and I got to spend Shabbat in Uganda with with some of them in the synagogue. Beautiful, wonderful. They can come on birthright. They can. They are conservative, between conservative and Reformed Jews, and they are very passionate. However, if they want to make Aliyah, they're not considered Jewish. Why? Because they were collectively converted and do not have Jewish roots along the way. So you have some of them who came to Israel to study to be rabbis, but cannot make Aliyah officially. You can have them come on different tours and programs and things, but they don't enjoy the right of return due to their lack of Jewishness. Let's call it that way. So these are different examples of why these three Jewish tribes are conflicting in so many ways. It affects politics, it affects a lot of different things. We don't have a lot of time left, but before we move to our other part, one of the things I mentioned, no, you know what, we're going to skip this because we don't have the time. We're going to skip to our fourth tribe, which is considered the Arab tribe in Rivlin's speech, but it's the others. But before we move to that, are there any comments or questions about the Jewish tribes in Israel? So the main three tribes are the secular, Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, but we saw there's so much in between.
All good.
Okay, so this quote, a very, very important mitzvah, a commandment that we have in Judaism, and you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. If you remember, long time ago when we started this evening, I showed you that quote of to develop the country for the benefit of all of its inhabitants, right? We don't only have Jewish people. There have never been only Jewish people in this land of Israel. So let's talk about them a little bit and talk about this fourth tribe, which I'm not going to talk only about Arabs, but also other minorities in Israel. So let's start with the obvious and the more controversial. If we talked about the lived land last time, the conflicts that we have or controversies, a little bit this, Palestinians. The term Palestinians, does anyone know where that name comes from?
Irene has her hand raised.
Yes, Irene. Go ahead.
You're muted, Irene.
The Philistines.
Oh.
Now we can hear you.
The Philistines.
The Philistines. Interesting. So some connect, and thank you for that. Some connect it and try to connect it historically to the Philistines. But in more recent history, that name was created in some other way. So in all the rounds of people ruling the land of Israel throughout the different decades, the Roman ruled for quite a while in this area. And after the rebellion of Bar Kokhba and his troops, they decided to sort of punish the Jewish people and say, we're not going to have the province of Judea anymore. This whole area is going to be considered as Palestina, Provincia Palestina. It's a Roman name that was given to this area. And for many, many years, by the way, if you ask about Israeli Arabs or Palestinians or others, different names that could give, a lot of them see themselves as part of southern Syria, because this was a bigger part of southern Syria in the Ottoman Empire. And the name Palestina was a province of the Roman Empire that was kept for centuries later. And this portion of land was called Palestina due to that. By the way, by the Palestinian Charter, the Palestinian People Charter from the 1960s, they consider Palestinians anyone who inhabited the land of Israel before 1947, including the Jewish people who inhabited the land before 1947. Meaning my grandfather was Palestinian. My grandfather had an ID with the word Palestine on it in Hebrew. This was Palestina, Palestine. There was no Palestinian identity or entity. There was a formal political entity. There was no a Palestinian state. After 1948 and the war of 1948, different separations and changes of the map created a conflict within the Israeli Arabs, who were considered themselves a part of the greater Arab nations, and trying to fight for their right of return. They were refugees. I'm not going to go into the entire history, but in 1964, declared themselves as the Palestinian people with their charter. The PLO was founded, Palestinian Liberation Organization, and they started fighting for the liberation of the Palestinian people. What does it mean exactly? it's somewhat hard to say. Between 1948 and 1967, most Palestinians were a part of Jordan or Egypt. Some fled to Lebanon, some Syria, and other places. And in 1967, after the 6 Days War, Israel regained some of the territory, or gained some of the territories, and those people became a part of the Israeli land. Yes, Laura, raise your hand. I can see it.
Thank you, Shai. I'm wondering how the definition in the Palestinian Charter that you just described, how does that mesh with the United Nations refugee definition for Palestinians?
That is a great question. So for that, let's talk about the definition. So the UN talks about refugees, anyone who had to flee the country or look for refuge around the world for war or danger, for their lives, so on and so forth. And there is an agency in the UN that takes care of refugees all around the world. For the Palestinians, there's UNRWA, which is a different, separate entity within the UN to take care of only Palestinian refugees. By the way, we're talking about millions around the world, and they have a very special status. They're the only refugees who inherit the status of refugees. In most cases, if you're a refugee who moved to, let's say, the United States from, I don't know, Sudan, and you settled and you received a refuge, your children will be American citizens after they were born here. Palestinians inherit it. That means that their grandchildren and great-grandchildren are still considered to be refugees. So when we're talking about a right of return for Palestinians, we're not just talking about those to the land of Israel, those who are actual refugees who left their homes physically them. We're talking about generations and generations. How does it form together with this? A good question, because with time it gets harder to differentiate. Yes, they do say that those are anyone who inhabited the land before 1947, before the declaration of the UN of the establishment of the State of Israel, and that includes, as I said, the Jewish people. However, the charter of other organizations, for example, Hamas, do not include Jewish Israelis in this concept of who is a Palestinian. And with the increasing number of Palestinians around the world and different places, the concept has changed tremendously. So we're talking about Palestinians. We talk about the conflict, Israeli-Palestinian conflict. When people come and talk about, but the Palestinians, Israel is an apartheid state, or the Palestinians don't have rights. We need to differentiate different types of Palestinians. There's not one type of Palestinian. And it is very, very important to recognize. So we have what we call the Israeli Arabs, who some of them do consider themselves Palestinians because of their ancestry. We're talking about almost 2 million. These are the people that we talk about who are, most of them are citizens, full right citizens in Israel, just like me, and they get to have representation in the Knesset, get to sit in the Supreme Court, get to be whoever they want to be, whatever they want to be, have the passport like any other citizen, any other place. So when people talk to me about Palestinians and rights and everything, I ask them what kind of Palestinians are, or which Palestinians are talking about, them or those of East Jerusalem, who after the 6 Days War, when this area of Jerusalem was conquered or was replaced in Israel, got to receive a status of official. They carry Israeli IDs, they cannot receive a passport. However, they can ask to become citizens of Israel. Most of them do not choose not to do that and to be identified as Palestinians who are not citizens. Since they're not citizens but are legal inhabitants of the land, residents of Israel, they have certain rights, but not all the rights. And I tell people, just like me, I'm here legally in the United States now, but I'm not a citizen. I cannot vote. I cannot run for office. I cannot do a lot of things that other people can do because I'm not a citizen, just like any other place. So we're talking about East Jerusalem. We're talking about a combination of close to 500,000 people. Again, I don't want to get into the politics and the news too much. If you heard of Sheikh Jarrah in the news, different places in East Jerusalem, this is what we're talking about. Judea and Samaria, or what is called the West Bank, is a different situation. 2.3 million Palestinians, but those are Palestinians who live under the Palestinian Authority. They have their own entity. They have their electives. They have their security forces. They have their police. They have an economy very much impacted by Israel. Also depends on which part of Judea and Samaria you live in. If you are completely under Israeli ruling, if you're completely under Palestinian ruling, or if you're under Palestinian ruling with Israeli security measures, it differs. But those are not Israeli citizens. Hundreds of thousands of them do receive proper certificates to come and work in Israel, to be able to travel into Israel and different things, but they're their own different entity. So this is, an equivalent of asking for equal rights for me and them in Israel, like asking for equal rights for in the United States for example, Ken and a Canadian person, in a way, right? A different entity. And of course, we're talking about Gaza, the Gaza Strip right here. Now, here, the Judea and Samaria and in the Gaza, between 1948 and 1967, those were ruled by Egypt and Jordan, Jordanian ruling and Egyptian ruling. And they were not absorbed and did not receive the rights of those states for many, many years until the 1967 war. And then they were again placed within Israel. So the whole conflict of rights and different things is a whole different topic, but we're talking about millions of Palestinians, right? Where where about almost 4.5 million of them are not actually within the territory of Israel, because they're in Judea and Samaria and Gaza, well, territory of Israel, depending on who you ask, but under Palestinian Authority and Gaza, Hamas ruling Gaza. And we're talking about 1.9 million Israeli Arabs of different sorts. Not all of them consider themselves Palestinians, by the way, and we're going to talk about them now. So those are the numbers of the Arabs. Any questions about Palestinians before we move on? I know that usually this is the main dish, talking about Palestinians, before we move on to other groups that are considered also, some of them, part of Israeli Arabs or others. So this is our chance to talk about Palestinians.
I'll just add one number for people to have an idea. Right now, we have something somewhere between 10 and 15 out of the 120 Knesset members who self-identify as Palestinians. So we're going to say about a 10% of the elected officials of Israel are Israeli Arabs, or that also identify themselves as Palestinians. And for the first time, some of them are part of the government. They had some positions in the past in the Knesset for sure, but now they're part of the ruling coalition, and this is completely new to the history.
Absolutely. In the past, in the second and third elections, in all the rounds of 200 rounds we had in the 2 years, the third largest party or list in the Knesset, in the parliament, was the Joint Arab List. That created a big portion of that. And for the first time, as Rav Natan said, in the coalition, in the ruling side of the Knesset, the parliament, along with the government, we have a Muslim Palestinian identified party. Okay. So those are the Palestinians, but the Israeli Arabs are made out of more and other groups. For example, the Druze. The Druze are an ethnic group, speak Arab. They're Arabs, mostly in the north of Israel. Some of the Druze throughout the years, they have families in Syria. Some of them are chose not to be citizens of Israel. Most of them live in the Golan Heights, which is the very far east north of Israel, due to the fact that the Golan Heights might one day be Syrian territory again, and they do not wish to be Israeli citizens in that case, to not conflict with Syria. But they're an ethnic group. They kind of split out of the Islam in the 11th century, originated in Egypt. They believe in reincarnation. They have their own different perspectives. They're a very secret religion. They do not share their practices and different things outside of their own people, and they do not usually marry outside of their own people. According to statistics, around 2018, 2019, about 143,000 Druze, where out of them, about 20,000 are not citizens of Israel. Those in the Golan Heights, which I mentioned before, they are strong in their beliefs in the, I forgot the word. Sorry.
Beivrit.
Ne'emanut.
Their fidelity, their loyalty to the state is very, very strong, which is they might fight their own family because of that. Let's say you have a cousin who lives in Lebanon who is Druze. Because of their belief, their cousin in Lebanon has to fight for Lebanon, and you have to fight for Israel no matter what. And this is going to be more important their family ties, and it's very unique. I never heard of any other people that have that kind of loyalty to the country, that they're citizen beyond any other family or religion ties. And one more thing about the religion that I find very, very interesting, also very different than us. At some point in life, I don't remember exactly what age, I think it's some 15, 20 years old, you have to decide if you want to be secular or religious. So what Shai was explaining, that they're very secret about their religion. At some point, you know a little bit, you're asked, do you want to learn more? Once you're in, and you're going to have to keep that secret forever and all of that. Or you want to be a secular Druze, you still follow the rules, but you have no idea why. You have no access to the books or anything. And they really make that choice. Very interesting. In every family, you might have some people who choose to go one way, other way, and it's a very interesting group.
Yep. Thank you for that and for helping me with my lack of English for a second. I don't know why. So this is one group, very loyal, most of them serve in the IDF and are very loyal. If you heard of the Bill of Nationality from 2018, they were very upset because the Bill of Nationality in Israel places Jewish people first, let's put it that way. And the Druze said, we're so loyal, and how can you put us as almost, and I'm being cautious here, second-class citizens in a way? So there were adjustments to the Bill of Nationality that is still very controversial in many ways. Another Arab group is the Bedouins. Bedouins are nomad Muslims. This is what you can call them, different tribes from the deserts. The word Bedouins come from Badaya, which is the Arab word for desert. Mostly living in the Negev, in the south of Israel, in the desert, but about almost 300,000 of them live in the south of Israel, and around 110,000 people of them live in the north of Israel. Those who live in the north, mostly in towns, cities, more structures. Those in the Negev, like the photo that you have here, still in tents and other things. One of the greatest attractions when you travel Israel, go to a Bedouin tent and have some Turkish coffee. Why not? So over 400,000 Bedouins, about 3.5% of Israelis. Bedouins. Not related. I got confused with what I wrote here. The interesting thing with the Bedouins is a lot of them do choose to join the IDF, and a lot of them serve as gashashim, as scouters, or I don't know how to translate it completely, that use their skills of living with the ground to find tracks, to track footprints and different things, to identify maybe someone was around who should not be there. Conflicts, a lot of conflicts with them due to lack of infrastructure where they live. There's a lot of crime in their areas. We talked about education, very problematic with Bedouins. Right now, with the new government and new budget that are coming, they're talking about putting more funds into helping Bedouins, especially in the Negev, for formation of proper towns, proper infrastructure, proper education for their children.
That Arab group that is now part of the government pushed for that. That was one of the things that they brought. Like, this is our people, the people we are representing. We have to bring money to them as well.
Absolutely. Another interesting group that people don't really know about are what we call Circassians, or however, Circassians. These are Muslims their origins is in a bit north of Israel, between Russia and Turkey, there's a strip of land, Kavkaz, and this is where they come from. And they immigrated, we're talking about a long time of immigration, over 100 years. It's between Asia and Europe, and they live mostly in the north of Israel. We're talking about a few thousands. Their military service is mandatory for men, not for women. Very loyal to the state as well. A very small sect of Muslims that belong in their small corner, but are considered in that block of others, or Israeli Arabs in a way. So this is one group. One last group that we might talk about are Armenians. If you remember, we talked about the 4 quarters of the old city. The Armenian quarter that has existed there for years and years. Armenians have been in Israel since the 4th century. Crusades, different things brought them into, from Armenia into Israel, settling, creating a patriarchy of the church that is somewhat separate from other sects of Christianity in Israel. During the Holocaust, by the way, a lot of Armenians came to Israel, fleeing the Holocaust, because they were also targeted in Europe in many ways. So we're talking about a total of about 7,000 Armenians in Israel, where about 1,500 of them actually live in the Armenian quarter in the old city. Some of their contributions to Christianity and to culture in Israel was marking and following some of the Via Dolorosa, some of the holy places in Israel to the Christian people, and they're considered in many ways guardians of some of those places, mostly in the old city of Jerusalem. So they're also a small minority in Israel. The church, they own quite a lot of property in Jerusalem, actually, mostly, but they're a part of the Christian population in Israel, a different sect of Christianity.
Maybe you heard in the news a couple years ago, that group of Christians, they have their, what they call the patriarch, which is their pope, to say. And for the first time in generations, I don't know exactly how long, the Pope in Rome came to Jerusalem to visit the patriarch. And both of them talked for the first time in generations, completely aside, and really came together recently.
Thank you. So that we see, it's interesting, the developments of religions all around the world, different ways. We see how the Druze are a sect that left Islam and turned that. Armenians are this with their patriarchy. In Judaism, we have all of our things, very similar in all ways. So not only did we talk about the 3 quarters of the tribes that are Jewish and all that is in there, we also talked about the Arab tribe, but also the others that we have. Israeli population is made of so many things, and Israeli culture is so mixed together in beautiful ways, controversial ways, conflictual ways, but also creating a lot of opportunities, I think, for different literal colors, but cultures in Israel. And I hope, and I'm sure Rav Natan will join me in that this gave us an opening to an understanding, a better understanding of some of the things that we hear about Israel, understand about Israel, see about the conflict, and also about the relationship of Jewish people within themselves in Israel that also connects to us here. I do want to say that everything that has to do with Reform Conservative, the Western Wall, conversions, most of the, let's call it the average Joes and Janes in Israel, don't really know about it too much. They don't care about it too much. They don't really know about it too much. I'm very exposed to it because I've been working with Jewish education for 15 years. So when something comes up about the Kotel settlement, oh my God, they rejected it, and now the reform movement in the United States is livid about it. Most of the Israelis would not have any idea what I was talking about. To give you that, but that's a whole different, like I said, maybe another session about religion and state in Israel. And before we have more time for comments, questions, it is very late, so I want to thank everyone for sticking with me. I hope it was teaching and interesting. And Rav Natan, if you want to add something, or anyone questions or comments about everything we talked about.
Thank you so much, Shai. That was amazing. And maybe if I would summarize one takeaway that I'm having from from our conversation tonight is that and that's exactly a little bit of the song we skipped, but all of you, I emailed you earlier today. You got a link to that song, so you can see exactly that one that we skipped. Is that anywhere in the world, generalization is a problem. In Israel, this is not a problem. This is impossible. The amount of diversity that we saw today is still maybe half of the real diversity, right? We could break it down into so many more ways. So whenever people say, oh no, but Israelis X, Y, and Z, forget it. Don't even take it seriously. There is no way that any Israeli would like fully agree about anything. So the same way that Shai was talking about the conflict, like when people say, oh, let's talk about the Palestinians, like, wait, which Palestinians, right? The same thing happens to Israel as a whole, right? Whenever we talk about it, wait, which Israel? The Israel from the Mizrahim, who the same way, for example, we see here conversing about reparations for the Black community. In Israel, you could say the same thing about reparations to people who for decades have not received any money from the government, right? And taken to other places. And this is still part of the conversation there. Who votes for what? Israel is known to be one of the countries with the largest amount of parties, right? Here we're used to just two major ones and a few here and there. Right now in the Knesset, we have more than 10 parties. And just in the coalition, we have like 8, which is like absurd. You have 8 parties completely different with divisions among the parties themselves, right? Really coming together to get something done. So maybe
I just want to say those are only the parties that actually managed to get over the threshold to become a part of the parliament of the Knesset out of about 31 parties who offered themselves to be, elected.
Yeah, you only get an asset if you have 3.25% of the votes. Less than that, you don't even get it. So my takeaway is that diversity is good and diversity is here to stay. It's our challenge to deal with it and with an inclusive perspective of the reality instead of be fighting against the reality, is understanding reality and trying to bring everyone together into creating the envisioned Israel together with the living Israel, right? With the terms we used last week. I really want to bridge the Yerushalayim Shel Mala, Yerushalayim Shel Mata, the upper Jerusalem, the envision, the idea to the real Jerusalem where we all live. I know that some people are going to have to go, and we totally understand. Given the time, Shai and I are going to stay for a couple minutes. If anyone have any comments, questions, I see that Zohar has his hand, so we're going to keep talking.
Okay, just quickly. So I think